My name is Kristen Anderson. I work with Associated Environmental Consultants. I specialize in stream and wetland restoration. My background is in stream and wetland restoration and as an erosion control professional. In the early years of my career, I spent a lot of time using conventional methods. As my career moved along, I began to use nature-based solutions and a replacement of some of these conventional techniques. These are practices involving the use of vegetation to get a stability function. And without the use of some of the man-made products like erosion control blankets that have a way of sort of limiting native woody riparian vegetation from getting established. My focus now in terms of dealing with erosion using nature-based solutions is to establish native woody riparian vegetation that mimics the natural processes, things that Mother Nature has done to stabilize northern rivers for years. We can now use and implement using soil bioengineering technologies and systems. I've been fortunate to work with the Town of Vegreville and the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program to develop a solution for this site using soil bioengineering, where we use live cuttings of willow and poplar to deal with erosion along the creek banks, particularly the Vermilion River, where the erosion was creating sloughing of the bank material and creating threats to an important asset to the community, which is Riverside Cemetery. I hope that everybody enjoys this presentation where we can see nature-based solutions in action, helping to protect this riverbank.
Hello, I'm Tim McPhee, the Mayor of Vegreville, and I want to welcome everybody here for this presentation. It's kind of a unique situation that we had here at our cemetery, and luckily Brianne attended a conference and got to know the Associated Environmental people. We went to a non-traditional solution for the erosion at the riverbank at the cemetery, and we created a habitat, not just trying to put a bunch of piles in the ground and hope for the best. So I hope you all enjoyed today's presentation, and I want to thank Brianne and Dale for all the work the department put into this, and again, Associated Environmental team and the government of Alberta. Thank you very much.
Well, good morning. Thank you guys so much for having me here today. I also like to thank Brianne and the Town of Vegreville for making this project possible, and especially the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program. The government of Alberta for years now has been supporting municipalities and other organizations to mitigate flooding and drought. And of course, the erosion situations that we see in a lot of our creeks are a result of high peak flow events that are related to flooding. And so the ability to utilize this funding program to deal with critical problems that municipalities face is really just tremendous. So thank you to all of you for making that possible. Just a little bit about me. I am a erosion control and restoration specialist working for Associated Environmental. I'm based out of our Edmonton office. And so my background is very much related to ecological restoration, reclamation, conventional erosion control. But today I'm going to talk to you about a little bit less conventional erosion control, and specifically the use of soil bioengineering, which we consider a nature-based solution. So I'm going to talk about the processes of erosion, what some of the techniques we use to deal with that type of erosion using soil bioengineering. I'm going to give you some examples of projects and case studies showing how those treatments actually work, and then some of the considerations for design and constructability. So this is a little bit of a diagram here. This shows that whatever happens in our watershed affects what happens in our water bodies, and particularly our creeks and our erosion. One of the things I like about this particular diagram on the left of the hydrologic cycle is it shows that the trees in the forefront of that diagram is where percolation is happening, because trees actually function extremely well to help get water back in the ground. And the reason for that is their roots act like pipelines down into the soil. When you have soil that's super compacted and super smooth, you get more runoff. And when you have precipitation events, collectively that runoff creates high flow volumes and velocities in our creeks and our rivers. This other picture of a tree also just shows how trees also help intercept a lot of the rainfall, in addition to improving percolation and infiltration into the deeper groundwater system. There's actually municipalities in the States where, depending on how many parking spots you put in, you have to plant a certain number of trees to offset that. So it's just really powerful how much trees and woody vegetation can do to help deal with stormwater problems. So here's a picture. This is actually the White Mud Creek in the city of Edmonton, a healthy creek. This creek is just long enough, just wide enough to handle all the runoff and debris and ice flows that it's going to receive. What happens is as development occurs in the watershed, we see more runoff, less infiltration, and that triggers the channel adjustment process. So now the creeks need to get wider, they need to get deeper in order to accommodate all the flows that are coming into it. And so as a result of that, we start seeing banks eroding, channels becoming more incised, and slumping, and escarpments forming, and all these sorts of things. In years past, river managers and river scientists were very focused on trying to make sure that we could keep the water in the channel and armor its banks and contain all the flows just as best as they could. And now the focus is more on just stepping back and restoring those habitats, building stability into them. Studies actually have shown that when there is a major flooding event, that the damages are more related to bank stability than it is to the inundation that's associated with that flood event. It's not if, it's when there's a flooding event. Those areas that are highly degraded, the damage is catastrophic. When you have a site like this, it's resilient to that flooding event and it bounced back with pretty minimal damage to it. When we look at a lot of our developed areas in Alberta, what we see is development coming fairly close to our creeks and our rivers. And what is that happening? They're removing that woody, native woody riparian vegetation, replacing it with impervious surfaces. That means more runoff. And one of the problems associated with that runoff is that it's causing the bank material to get wet. And when the bank material is wet, it has less shear strength. In other words, it doesn't hold together nearly as well when you have high flows or lots of erosion forces on it. And so what you end up seeing is that bank material is wet, erosion processes within the stream channel itself occurs, and the material just sort of slumps and it leaves behind an escarpment. So this is another picture. This is actually the Mill Creek in Edmonton. But this is an example of a trail system put immediately adjacent to the creek. Same thing, the riparian vegetation was removed. We have sort of a hard compact surface contributing runoff, making the bank material wet. But there's something else going on. It's in common with both of these sites, and I want to point out the fact that they're both located on the outside bend of the creek. And what happens at the outside bend of a creek is you have higher flow velocities. Higher flow velocities translates to toe erosion or undercutting of the bank. And so when you have now that heavy bank material and a lot of precipitation and high flows, that undercutting in combination with those other factors causes the material to slump. So it's a little hard to see, but on this particular bank, it's also located at the outside bend. So it had all of the things happening. Outside bend with high flow velocities, undercutting, that was a result of that. Some additional runoff from the trail being an impervious surface, and the riparian vegetation removed for the placement of a trail. And it's like clockwork. You can go to pretty much any creek in Alberta, and this is what it looks like when you put those three factors together. And then we think about like any erosion problem. I look at it and says, well, what's causing this from naturally recovering? Because there's a lot of sites when there's some sort of natural disaster or disturbance, if you don't hurry up and restore it, it will restore itself. But usually there's some sort of barrier or filter to that natural recovery process. In a case like this, again, undercutting, bank slumped, river took that soil material away. What we're left with is an oversteepened bank. And that oversteepened bank is too steep for vegetation to catch and reestablish itself. And so that's a situation that we can kind of step in and try and deal with. Another filter to recovery is soil compaction. It's a picture of the fire break in Fort McMurray after the 2016 wildfires. Lots of bulldozing and compaction of those soils. If, and the result of soil compaction is more runoff, but it also creates a condition where vegetation won't naturally reestablish. You look at our natural forests after a disturbance, you can clear cut an area, and the very next summer it'll be just shooting up with balsam poplar and all the kind of early successional tree species. But when you have soil compaction, that can't happen. It's a barrier to that. in excessive erosion, this is actually not far from where I took the previous photograph, this is what happens on the slopes below those compacted surfaces. And again, ongoing erosion is a filter recovery because vegetation may seed itself in, but it's just going to be washed away from those rills and gullies that have formed. And so, yeah, we look at all of these situations together: lack of woody vegetation, some toe erosion, excess moisture, and what we've left behind is these escarpments that are difficult to get vegetated. What I'm going to talk to you about next is how we approach those sorts of sites using soil bioengineering. And soil bioengineering is a term for using vegetation to provide an engineering function or a stability function. And we use live cuttings of willow, balsam poplar, and sometimes red osier dogwood, because those are three species that are common in our riparian areas, and they will root from a cutting. In other words, I can take a stem, trim it up, and I'll show you some examples of that. I can put it in the ground 1 meter, 2 meters deep if I want, and it will root from a cutting, and those roots will help improve soil stability. You think about grasses, a lot of times we use grass seed to get vegetation cover and help prevent erosion. A big difference there is those woody species have much deeper root systems and a much greater diversity of rooting depth and diameter, and so that provides a lot more, again, shear strength to the soil. But a lot of these erosion problems and these slumping issues are moisture problems. And so species like balsam poplar, which is one of the most common trees in Alberta, it is actually really good at pulling soil moisture out of the ground. In fact, they say a mature balsam poplar can remove over 100 gallons of water from the soil in a day. Now, that's a mature tree. We don't plant mature trees with these projects, but what we do is we work with strength in numbers. So I'll show you what I mean there. And they're self-healing and self-sustaining, so you can have beavers chew them up and ice flows take them down, and they're kind of like weeds. They will grow back. And there's so many other environmental benefits, like I mentioned, anything from like carbon sequestration, biodiversity support, wildlife habitat, and of course there's a lot of aesthetic value compared to some of the more conventional methods of dealing with erosion. So a few project examples. This is a slope at a reservoir. This happens to be located in the county of Grand Prairie. And there was a landslide that you can see occurred here. What's up at the top of that slope? You guessed it, lots of smooth, compact surfaces. It was actually a reclaimed gravel pit. And of course, in the old days when those places were reclaimed, they just kind of smoothed it out and seeded it with grasses and legumes. So a significant amount of runoff was occurring, causing the saturation, and of course, also located in a river valley. And one thing that we know about river valley slopes is they're naturally prone to landslide activity. You have that layer of soil, maybe it's 1 meter or 2 meters deep, but usually it's on top of clay shale. And if that becomes really saturated, it will want to move along with the force of gravity. And of course, last thing you want is a bunch of soil going into your drinking water reservoir. So there's another shot of sedimentation into the reservoir on the slope. And this was planted with live cuttings of balsam poplar. In fact, we put them in at about 3 cuttings per square meter, so about a foot apart. And they went into the ground a whole meter. This is a bit of a diagram showing you that, but a whole meter goes into the ground, and with them just being about 30 centimeters apart, within a single growing season, the root systems are totally interlocked, and you get a tremendous amount of stability. It's quite a steep slope. The guys were installing that. We did it a little bit in the fall and a little bit in the spring to finish it up. He was, in the spring, kind of slid a little bit on his way down and grabbed one of the cuttings. And it was incredible the amount of roots that were on this cutting. And it had only been in the ground for a few weeks. They're very effective pretty quickly, and they just get stronger as they grow. This is the same landslide site on the first summer after it was planted. So you can see it's just a wall of green. And so the other alternative solution that was proposed was actually cutting the slope back 2 to 1 and armoring it with rock. Would have been several magnitudes more expensive to do that project. It was over $1 million, whereas I think we spent $150,000 on this project. And one of the benefits there is you can imagine getting an excavator on that slope to cut it back from 2 to 1 and put all that rock, just undertaking the safety risk. So sometimes soil bioengineering techniques are extremely beneficial, just simply by being able to use hand tools instead of, dealing with those safety issues of getting heavy machinery out on those slopes. We can also use cuttings when we're building slopes. A lot of our fill slopes that we build can be treated by putting cuttings. These cuttings are probably over 2 meters long, just the tips sticking out of the ground. So you can imagine the rooting depth you can get in a project where you're using this technique, which we call brush layers. Brush layers are put in while a slope is being reconstructed. Other thing I want to show you is the application of making the soil rough and loose. We talked about how smooth, compact soils are great for creating a ton of runoff that can create a lot of damage. So this is the North Saskatchewan River Valley slope. It's really close to Fort Saskatchewan. So if you guys who spend much time up there know that it's quite a steep, long River Valley slope. And this is an outfall project that went in. You can see from this image that there's a silt fence at the top of the slope. And as is the case most places in that part of the North Saskatchewan River, you have cultivated fields in the flat areas. And then as you dip into the River Valley slope, we have trees in place. But because there was a lot of cultivated field draining to this area, this particular summer we put this in, it rained basically every day that summer. I think it was 2019. I'm sure you guys remember that. And that silt fence would get blown out from the rain, from the surface runoff from the cultivated field. It would blow out the silt fence at the top of the hill, and then it would enter our rough and loose soil configuration and just dissipate, just sink into the ground. I'll show you a little bit closer picture. It's a little hard to appreciate, but we make the soil rough and loose by using an excavator bucket, creating a series of pits and mounds, kind of in a checkerboard fashion. So runoff cannot accumulate any volume or velocity in a situation like that. We also have, of course, woody debris spread on the site, again, adding more roughness, but also creating a condition where trees and shrubs want to regrow. It helps soil biology. There's balsam poplar cuttings in at about 1 per square meter in this case. And so there's another picture. You can see a little bit more of how rough and loose the soil is. And again, a tremendous technique for dealing with erosion on steep slopes. Again, conventional way to do this might be to smooth it out real good, put on some erosion control blanket, some grass seed. You gotta smooth it real good for erosion control blanket to work, right? And then you probably never see a tree grow on that slope, actually. Because grasses provide a tremendous amount of competition to trees, and trees don't like smooth, compact ground. At the base of the slope, we use willow cuttings. So for a few meters along the edge of the river, it creates a lot of roughness. As the willows sprout and grow, the root systems, these are down in the ground about 80 centimeters. The root systems, again, grow and stabilize that soil. And as we have high flows in the North Saskatchewan River, provides a tremendous amount of stability. So similar treatment here is dense live staking. This concept of putting willow stakes at the toe zone is important because you can also see this is at the outside bend where the highest flow velocities occur. And the ability to slow flows is tremendous in terms of reducing erosion risk. Because again, it's those high flows where you have most of the force acting on the bank material. And so the cuttings are put in about a 1, sometimes a 2 meter wide band on that toe zone, because ultimately the root cause of these sites that are eroding and getting undercut and subsequently slumping is all that erosion in the toe zone. We have a similar situation where runoff is coming off of the trail during rain events, and we have wet bank material undercutting, riparian vegetation removed for the trail, again, like clockwork. So what we're left behind with is a slump. So we use the toe staking. This is another project that was possible due to the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program in the town of Devon. It's just another close-up of the toe staking in that toe zone. This is another picture of the same trail system. Again, a project partnered with the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program, just a little bit of a before and after. So that escarpment, I want to talk about it. We've looked at those over-steepened slopes now in a few photos. One of the ways to deal with that is to create a condition where vegetation can grow. So we talked about it. It's that steep, vegetation never really gets a chance to catch. And so wattle fences is a way to deal with that. I'll show you how they're built. You can see there's some toe staking there. Get the toe staking in until it's too steep to do so. And then we deal with that escarpment by building water fences. So wattle fences means putting in fence posts, so some vertical stakes, and then behind those fence posts, aligning it with long cuttings of balsam poplar and willow as a horizontal portion of the fence. And then soil is dragged from the slope above and helps keep those horizontal cuttings pressed up against the vertical fence posts. And then you build your next fence and move on from there. So again, we're creating a condition where vegetation can establish. So here's another example of a little slump. Volunteers did this in a half a day. Actually, again, thanks to the Watershed Resiliency and Restoration Program. And that's what it looks like now. You can walk by it. You can't really even tell that we were there. It just blends right in. So that brings me to our project here at the Town of Vegreville. And at the Riverside Cemetery, we have a similar situation to some of the things we've been talking about. And our site's located right here. And I think you're going to notice right off the bat, we're located on the outside bend of the creek, and also lots of smooth compact surfaces, as is the case in almost all of our municipalities, contributing some runoff. But being present at the outside bend of the creek was a cause tow erosion to happen along the banks of the river. The picture on the right is just a little bit of what that escarpment looked like before the project began. So just again, tow erosion, slumping, and a big escarpment left behind. So we used very similar treatment where we were able to install dense live staking using willows at the tow zone of the creek. And on the escarpment above, we built wattle fences made from willow and balsam poplar. And so that's a picture taken this summer. So the project was installed in the fall of last year. And some remaining installation occurred during the spring of this year, 2024. The growth has been excellent. I led the design of the project with associated environmental, got the regulatory approvals in place. We had a skilled contractor complete the installation of the project. And then the Town of Vegreville has been actively maintaining it, dealing with particularly watering the first couple of years while the plants get established. So a great group of partners to make this project a good success. Just a couple of other shots. Again, just showing those treatments from another angle is our dense live tow staking along the tow zone at the outside bend of the creek, and our wattle fences above that in both cases. I will say there's another thing happening at this particular site, which is happening in the North Saskatchewan River Valley system and most of our river valleys throughout Alberta, which is just the presence of species that are invasive and non-native, and particularly things like caragana and the toba maple. There's one thing that both of those two species has in common is they're allelopathic, which means that they release a substance in the soil that actually prevents other things from growing. And so they're really good at taking over. And unfortunately, they don't have the same level of root density and diversity that some of our other native riparian vegetation has. And that's why when we focus on these kinds of treatments, we look as much as possible to establish these native woody riparian species to the greatest extent possible. This one's called live silt fence. Live silt fence is a concept of trying to slow flow velocities in a channelized flow environment. So this is a ditch, a constructed ditch actually in an industrial site, but in fact, they were having this ditch and culvert get blown out every year. So the idea here was we could put strips of willow cuttings perpendicular to the direction of flow at a really high density, and it effectively slows velocity. And what happens when water slows down is sediment drops out. Many of our sites, again, when we look at trying to fix the erosion problem, is we like to minimize how much runoff is coming to these erosion sites to begin with. It's an industrial site, so none of that was possible. And unfortunately, a lot of sites, that option doesn't exist. And so we spaced out our live silt fences just wide enough so an excavator could get a bucket in there and clean the sediment out. This is a live silt fence put a little bit closer up. So what you can see is these strips of cuttings, the cuttings are only a couple centimeters apart. And then there's multiple rows in each silt fence. So each row is about maybe 10 centimeters apart. And so very effective at strapping sediment, actually. So there's a picture showing some of that sediment deposition in between the live silt fences that started growing. Live pole drains is another technique that I apply on a number of sites. This is the idea of bundling up cuttings in alternate directions, using some ratchet straps, tighten it up, and then twine to tie them off. And you can bury these in shallow channels. So this is the sort of treatment we would use when we have issues with slopes getting very wet and needing to get that water moved safely to the base of the slope where it can discharge. And so those trenches are backfilled, leaving just a couple of centimeters at the top of the pole drain to allow light so the cuttings can actually grow. So it creates a totally stabilized preferential flow path that's totally stabilized, and the willows will actually grow. So again, seepage gullies, places where water wants to just sit, because again, when we have a lot of moisture on our slopes, they do want to slump and slide. And so this is a technique you would use when you're trying to get that water to move, again, off of the slope so it can discharge safely at the base. This is not a treatment you would use where you have channelized flows. Actually would wash them out if you did, but you can see once they get growing, you can't even really tell that they're there. So again, I want to talk a little bit about how these things go in the ground, and what we do is we generally put about 3/4 of the cutting buried in the ground. So this is an example of a willow cutting that's 1 meter long with 80 centimeters in the ground. I know it's a little more than 3/4, but I like to get as much in the ground as I possibly can. You want enough rooting happening to support what's got to happen on the above ground portion of the plant. And we use cuttings that are at least 1 inch thick at the diameter. There are a few species that don't produce very thick cuttings. We'll maybe allow some smaller diameter cuttings to go in the ground, but we do find that plants with the oldest tissue have the most energy to produce the roots and the shoots that we need to get these things growing. That's another aspect is, selecting cuttings that are very healthy. We want smooth, healthy bark. You're gonna find a lot of willow stands out there where the bark is very furrowed and splitting and cracking, and that's particularly the case if you found a stand of willows in maybe a drained wetland area where it's kind of stressed out and hurting for moisture. So always looking for sites that are having nice, healthy, straight, smooth, healthy bark. And straight's important, because I'm telling you, you gotta put these things in a pilot hole, and putting a crooked cutting in a straight pilot hole isn't fun. So when we do the installation of these things, we do need to put pilot holes in the ground. Ever so often you'll find a site where the ground's soft, but you guys live in Alberta too. It's a lot of clay. And so these pilot holes can be done mechanically or manually. You can see on the right, this gentleman has got a planting bar or a dibble where he's using a steel bar, hexagonal in shape, to drive open a pilot hole. On the left, we have a gas-powered auger. That's a really effective way of doing that. Some of my contractors will even use a water stinger system where they hook up to a pump and a water source and have a bar with water. It's kind of like a hydrovac. It just puts a little hole in the ground, creates a slurry, and we're able to use that technique as well. Other tools we like to use, pruning shears. That's how we collect our cuttings and trim all their side branches off. We use saws to cut them, pruning shears to take the side branches, planting bars and post hole augers and things of that nature to get our pilot holes open. Sometimes we use an axe to sharpen up the tips of the cuttings, and a rubber mallet to tap them in, and some twine to bundle them up. So a lot of hand tools. And then the last thing I'll mention is we always do have to consider the monitoring and the maintenance aspect. So once these things are installed, just generally a 1 to 2 year period where we need to be very concerned with the plants getting established. So what are some of the threats to that? Heat and drought. So watering is usually a critical component, particularly with wattle fences. You'll see it's used less and less the further south you move in Alberta for that reason. They don't have as much soil contact as a good old-fashioned willow cutting going in the ground. So we do need to water them for a couple of years. We have to worry about weeds in some sites, particularly disturbed sites where the weeds will come in pretty quick. So for, again, a couple of years, it's important to keep them back where they're competing for light and water and even root competition in some cases. And of course, herbivory. So you'll see there's a fence. You'll see that on the photographs at the Riverside Cemetery in Vegreville. Beaver are unfortunately a big fan of balsam poplar especially. I think it's their favorite thing in the world. They also like willow cuttings. And so again, for that 2 year period after the installation, depending on the site, that could be a huge threat and until those cuttings get established. Once they're established, of course, beaver will come after them once they're their size that's appropriate for them, and they'll just simply grow back and retain that root stability in the soil. But in the meantime, some sites, that's a big concern. This is obviously the place where the Watershed Resiliency Restoration Program went into play to deal with the erosion on the stream bank. Obviously, we have an incredibly important asset to the community here, which is the Riverside Cemetery. And so being able to protect it using the nature-based solutions was just a tremendous opportunity. Again, when a lot of conventional stream bank stabilization projects are implemented, usually retaining walls or cutting the slope way back, and some of those things are not great options for this site. So again, we talked about being on the outside bend of a creek. We have higher flow velocities, so you can really see that. Water attacks in a straight line. That's just the way water moves. It goes straight forward. And so it attacks in a straight line. And so the undercutting of the bank was the sort of root cause of what happened at this site. And so the treatment that was applied was the dense live toe staking in about a 2-meter wide band. So all of the willow growth you see there at the base of the slope as a result of putting cuttings in the ground. So again, we used 1-meter long cuttings and we placed them in the ground about 80 centimeters. So even if there's really a high flow event in the spring, there's no way they're going to be washed out going down to that depth. So about 20 centimeters sticking above the ground helps to provide that effect of slowing the flow velocities and promoting sediment deposition. The other thing was the wattle fence. You can see the wattle fences were installed where the escarpment was present, and they were built with a combination of willow and balsam poplar. And so if you can get to the end, you can have a little bit of look in from the side where you can see they're essentially little mini retaining walls built out of willows and poplar. Why do we use willows and poplar? Because they will root from a cutting. So the preparation of these cuttings is to find a native stand, don't take too much, cut them down at the base, trim all the side branches off, and put your pilot holes in the ground, or in the case of a wattle fence, some of these are horizontal stakes that don't require a pilot hole, and they will root from a cutting that way. So again, we do need to collect the material during the dormant period. That's a key aspect of the planning of these projects, and then install them. And then we install in the spring and the fall season while the plants are still dormant. One of the reasons we take all the side branches off of the cuttings is we need the cuttings to root before they can really do anything in terms of shoot growth. But willows aren't smart enough to grow roots and shoots at the same time. So if we left all the side branches on our cuttings, what happens is those side branches are sucking energy from the plant. And so it's really important to trim all those side branches off so that the plant can just totally focus on root growth before it starts actually growing the shoots. So the wattle fences act as little mini retaining walls, where before it was nothing but an oversteep and slope too steep for vegetation to grow. Now we have these little benches in place where vegetation can establish. You'll notice that the growth of the willows along the toe zone has been excellent. Very dense growth. So when we see those high flow events, those high velocities, I challenge you to come out here and have a look at how slow you can actually physically see the water slow down when it enters that area of dense live toe staking. You can see that if you especially get a look from the side, that the lower fences have significant growth, the upper fences have a little bit less growth. This is something we've struggled with a lot the last 2 summers here in Alberta, where we've had months of extreme heat and drought. And so consequently, the need to water these wattle fences is really high. So we've had quite a bit of growth on our wattle fences in the areas where there hasn't been any growth. Again, is now creating a condition where growth can occur. And so the cuttings that are growing in the wattle fences will continue to spread. Sometimes we'll even come back and plant on those benches some other native woody riparian species to continue to, again, reestablish that plant community that's so effective at stabilizing the slope. You want to get something established, otherwise what'll grow there? Probably weeds. So sometimes we do come in when we have these extreme heat seasons. It can be quite difficult to get balsam poplar cuttings established and do some additional planting on those benches. But yeah, I think that what we see here is we've dealt with the toe erosion issue, which is the root of the problem with the undercutting. We've dealt with the escarpment problem that was not allowing any vegetation to get established by building our wattle fences. You can see our populations of carigana now have something to contend with. Well, that's a really good thing as well. And we're just going to see the slope continue to get more and more stable over the years. Well, again, I just want to thank the Town of Vegreville for this opportunity to assist with this project, the Watershed Resiliency Restoration Program, for making it happen and really promoting these nature-based solutions throughout the province. Thank you so much.
Yeah.